Welcome to episode 101 of the Headspace and Timing Podcast. This week is a pretty cool one. I'm joined by Dr. Katie Gordon and Brandon Saxton, hosts of the Jedi Counsel Podcast. Their show explores mental health and your favorite fictional characters from their background in clinical psychology. They've taken a look at The Big Lebowski, the Punisher series on Netflix, and of course, the comic book heroes. The concept for their show was so cool that I invited them to run one of our favorite military films through their process, Saving Private Ryan. Here's Brandon's thoughts on how psychology and mental health was portrayed in the film.
Speaking as someone who hasn't served in the military and a non-veteran, with my perspective, I think that the psychology of the film was just really well portrayed, both with the writing and the acting and just such a well-done film. And I think that a lot of the psychological themes related to the experiences of trauma and loss and making challenging decisions and grappling with morality and deciding what's the right thing to do or what's the good thing to do and are those the same. I think it depicted all of these themes so incredibly well and in a way that, at least from my perspective, seemed really genuine and accurate.
Welcome to the Headspace and Timing Podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Dwayne France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. I guess to get started, real quick, and of course we are going to talk about the movie, but maybe give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves and the Jedi Counsel Podcast.
My name is Katie Gordon. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am the co-host of a podcast called Jedi Counsel, where we explore mental health and psychological science through fictional characters, interviews, and other formats that appeal to us as they come up.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Brandon Saxton. I'm a pre-doctoral clinical psychology intern. I'll be graduating with my PhD in clinical psychology this summer. And I'm the other co-host of Jedi Counsel, which, like Katie described, just talking about mental health and a whole bunch of, mental health and psychology broadly, I guess, and a whole bunch of different kind of mediums and domains, I guess. Yeah.
And I really appreciate the two of you coming on. And Katie, as Brandon and I were mentioning, is this is sort of a common thing in graduate programs to sort of use fictional characters to kind of work through diagnosis.
Oh, interesting. That's definitely when I was teaching classes about mental health issues and therapy. That's something that I found helpful because obviously you don't talk about confidential cases and you can kind of change and give few details, but it's nice if you can talk about characters that people are familiar with or that you can show a clip and everybody's watching the same thing. I've found that useful. So honestly, I think that's where the podcast and our website really came from, was using fictional characters as a teaching tool.
Yeah, I have probably an overdramatic paper called The Madness of Raskolnikov, where I did a diagnosis of crime and punishment. And, and like you said, it's a good way to really look at characters in a different way. And then when we connected, and I was trying to think of a movie or something where we could, where you and Brandon, the two of you, could really kind of talk about and do your thing. Saving Private Ryan was the first one to come up. I, as a veteran, many veterans love this movie. It's almost the iconic World War II movie. It's so realistic. When it came out in the mid-90s, there were actually an increase in the calls to the VA. Many veterans, not just World War II veterans, but many veterans found it so realistic that it almost triggered memories. And so I really appreciate you coming on, or I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the movie. I'd like to hear both of your thoughts about the movie, looking at it from a mental health lens.
Sure. First, I want to say that we're really happy to have this conversation with you, too. We both care quite a bit about mental health generally, but also about veteran mental health. So it's great to talk to someone with the knowledge and expertise. And I just love what you're doing with your podcast. So it's fun that we can do this together. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I remembered something that happened many years ago. My grandfather both my grandfathers were World War II veterans, but one of them, I remember asking him if he was going to see Saving Private Ryan, and he said, I already saw it in real life the first time and I don't need to see it again. And so I think that speaks a little bit to how different people can respond to this. I imagine that for some people seeing the movie, it was validating or a way to share with people what they had gone through, whereas other people might be a painful reminder that they didn't want to experience again. And I, having not had firsthand experience, certainly felt at times like it seemed almost like a documentary. I mean, it moves so quickly and it's so overwhelming and excruciating for the majority of almost 3 hours that I think that even though you don't get to know characters very deeply, which kind of goes with it, you still get connected to them and kind of see how they're wrestling with survival, staying on mission, as they lose people left and right. I mean, the opening scene it's not like they ease into it either. I mean, right into this intense combat and this image of blood washing up on shore. So to me, it's very moving and certainly felt like it provided me with some more insight about how difficult it would be to deal with that in this situation, but then also looking back to it.
Yeah, I guess to add my thoughts, I know I just mentioned to you, Dwayne, while we were chatting before we started recording, that just today in my clinical internship, we actually had a didactic seminar on veteran and military mental health. So it was on my mind already. And then I came home right after work and started up the movie. And like Katie mentioned, it's about 3 hours long. So it just finished up a little bit before we started recording. So it's very fresh in my mind. And so I think it's interesting for me to hear about you describing how it's received by veterans in the military community. I understood and recognized that it was very, critically acclaimed and a well-received movie overall. So it's interesting for me to kind of hear or learn about some of that perspective, and that it's well-received and as well as had an impact on a lot of people in terms of what you're describing with increased calls to VA systems and things like that. In terms of the mental health piece, I think that there's a lot of really interesting and accurate, in my opinion or perspective, at least, depictions of mental health that I think are done very masterfully in how the acting is done and how things are portrayed, and in a way that I thought was somewhat subtle. I don't know if the intention was to just sort of like say, here's PTSD or here's a sign of PTSD, but things were a little more nuanced and a little more subtle. And I thought that was really interesting to return to the film. Like I had mentioned, I hadn't seen it in many years. So to return to it now with I think a more critical eye and watching for some of those things, I think the film is really masterful overall, as well as the way that I think, at least in as far as someone's perspective can be who's never been involved in the military or combat situations. It seemed like it really did a powerful job of depicting of what that situation or those scenarios might be like.
No, that's absolutely true, and I think it was very deliberate that way. There's actually so this was one of the first movies that Captain Dale Dye or I don't know if it was one of the first movies, but Captain Dale Dye, and he's an actor and he's been in some different things, but he focused on bringing realism to Hollywood, military realism. And he first worked with Tom Hanks on the Band of Brothers, and or he first worked with Tom Hanks here, and then they did Band of Brothers later. And actually, I'd had a friend of mine on his podcast had Dale Dye on, and Dale was a Vietnam veteran. And Dale, when he was talking about Band of Brothers, but he said exactly that. He said, we didn't want to create it so, parading somebody, there's a sign, this is PTSD right here, right? He said we needed to depict it in such a realistic way. And they did that. He was involved in this movie. He actually had a cameo. He was one of the officers in George C. Marshall's office when he was reading Abraham Lincoln's letter. The white-haired colonel, that's Dale Dye. So maybe if we can get into the movie, I know that we had talked about some different topics, but I'd like to hear your thoughts and where you'd like to start.
Sure. I think, one of the things that is interesting, as you mentioned, there are some signs of PTSD, but you also just see different ways of coping that don't fall in that category, which I thought seemed like a good point, because I think that sometimes, and you would know better than I, that sometimes it's kind of this idea that all veterans have PTSD, or if they have mental health issues, it's more related to that versus potentially other anxiety, depression, or grief issues, or just other kinds of issues. But the newest thing to me, which you had mentioned, was moral injury. And I read your blog post about that, which was really helpful for me understanding that. And I'd love to talk about that topic. Yeah.
So, in moral injury it's emerging as a concept. It's not actually a diagnosis yet, or whether it may or may not be. There's actually some discussion about whether it's parallel with post-traumatic stress disorder, a subset of it, but it's generally considered to be something separate. And it talks about how the environment can change what we believe to be right and wrong. What we believe to be right in one area is wrong in another. And so this is one of the things, after I learned about the concept of moral injury and looking at the movie, probably one of the easiest descriptions is when they're playing poker with the dog tags, or they're using the dog tags as poker chips, and they really don't see anything morally wrong with it. They're actually having a game, and even Captain Miller is standing above them kind of chuckling. And it's actually the medic that comes in that sort of brings it to their attention, that says, this is actually a very horrible thing that you're doing.
Yeah, that struck me too, because there are a couple of times where they're laughing or trying to make light of a situation, and I interpret that as they're desperately trying to cope and keep moving on despite these things that are going on around them, that almost each thing that's happening is enough that could shock someone and affect them for their life. And they just have repeated without much rest in between. But yeah, I thought that was very meaningful, because it kind of goes to the people who are walking by and their facial expressions, and they look hurt by how callous it is that they're doing this, even if they're not meaning it that way. It's like they're trying to just be lighthearted. And so the medic he reminds them of a basic moral code, that these are people's lives, and people are looking at you and it's hurting them. And I thought that was a very moving scene.
I think there are a lot of really good examples of that throughout the movie, in an area or a concept that was kind of new for me. So I was really trying to soak up the examples. But I think what's kind of interesting about it is that that's one example where, in a given situation, different people were at a different place in terms of their moral injury, or what was okay or wasn't okay. But then you also see examples of how that changes within a single person or individual throughout time. So I think that's kind of an interesting way where you could see stark examples across individuals, also within one individual over time, and how that changed. So I think there are just a number of really interesting examples of that throughout the film.
Yeah, it's really, to me, what a realistic depiction of how complex people are and how they're going to respond. There are situational factors, kind of individual factors, and time and how those events. So that's impressive that they were able to capture that.
Yeah. I don't want to shift off of the dog tag example maybe so quickly. I think that was a really good one too, or a really good example. But the one that stood out most in my mind was the interpreter of him, and how he very much advocated for letting the one soldier go, who is a prisoner, and everyone else very much wanted to kill him because the medic had just died. And he was very much against it and advocated to let him go. And so at that point, that's where he was at. He was at a very different place from several of the other people. And the captain eventually kind of came to his point as well. But then that changes very much at the end of the movie when he sees the perspective was a little bit hard for me to follow sometimes, but I think he saw the captain be shot by that person. Unless I'm mistaken, and correct me if either of you saw it differently, and that very much changes it for him then. And at that point, that that's the person, he shoots that person and lets everyone else go. So it's kind of this shift in his mind as to what was okay or what's right to do now versus what's right to do later on.
And he's interesting because he starts in kind of a non-combat role, right? They're asking if he's shot since basic training.
And he hadn't.
No, and so you see that change, and the others seem kind of annoyed, like you're new around here, you follow our lead. And the captain, the other powerful part of that original scene when they're arguing about the prisoner of war is when he reveals he's a school teacher, and when he's in his hometown, everybody says that makes sense, but it's a huge mystery while he's in combat. And I think that shows how different people can be in really strikingly different situations.
Yeah, I think that is another great example of, for military veterans, how we sort of exist in two different environments, two different worlds, as we call it, the hometown world, and what is right, so to speak, or what is good in one world is bad in the other. During deployments, for example, hypervigilance is what keeps veterans alive, right? It's pathological whenever it's, when you're in Walmart, so to speak. But a healthy dose of fear and anxiety sort of constantly is okay when you're in combat. And anger is sort of what drives you. And so emotions that are beneficial, or even things that are beneficial in combat, are not beneficial when you're not in combat. And things that aren't beneficial are. You had mentioned, I think, concern for the child as they go through one of the first villages, and Caparzo goes to rescue the little girl. That's compassion for children, compassion for others. Reminds me of my little sister. That's an emotion, or that's a sentiment that that would be okay if we're not in combat, but it actually proves to be dangerous when we're in combat. And Katie, you had mentioned something that Captain Miller had said.
Yeah, he said, we're not here to do the right thing. We're here to follow orders. And to me, that really stands out at how much of the lens has changed. I mean, even the parents handing off the children and begging to have their children taken away, that's highly unusual. But in the circumstances, they're trying to save their lives. And you kind of even see the little girl is furious with her and starts hitting her dad. And so you're absolutely right. It's kind of like everything is upside down, and good is bad and bad is good. And depending on what the context of the situation is.
And Brandon, you had mentioned, and this is going back to that dog tag scene, and I definitely want to revisit Wade's, the medic's role, but another example of just this absurdity was the glider that crashed.
Oh, right. Yeah, absolutely. That really that was another. I mean, the whole movie is powerful, but that was one that stood out in my mind as well. How they're very much describing this situation, how they had added, I think, a couple extra sheets of metal to the glider to keep this general safe. And they're kind of discussing like how ridiculous it was that they sacrificed the lives of 22 people just for the chance to keep this general safe. And then it shifts right away with I think Ryben is how you pronounce his name, and he says, yeah, there's a lot of that going on right now. Just kind of describing maybe his own thoughts or maybe bitterness. I don't know if that's the right word, but about the mission to save Ryan and his friends who are getting hurt or killed in kind of the spirit of that mission. So there is kind of this shifting set of yeah, so this wasn't okay. Why did they do this for this general is kind of what they're saying. But at the same time, yeah, we're doing this for Ryan. And that leads to pretty significant conflict between the various members of this group further on down the line.
It's so interesting because Ryan also says it's not fair, right? He recognizes that and doesn't even want to go home because it's not fair, because he's thinking of the perspective of the other people who've basically behaved the same way, but because of circumstance, he's able to go. And then the other thing that struck me is that he says, you know, these are the only brothers I have left. And I'm interested to hear from you, Dwayne. That seems like something I've heard before from veterans about those tight connections and not wanting to abandon people you care about. Did that strike you as something that rings true?
Absolutely. And I think even going back to how when Upham first came in, he wasn't accepted, right? He wasn't integrated into the group as quickly as Ryan was later, right? You know, so Ryan became very quickly part of the group, some through the respect that he showed to the other ones that were lost, but Upham hadn't proved himself yet, right? You know, he was the FNG, the freaking new guy, right? And he was the guy that he is the outsider coming into in group, and tragically wasn't accepted until the very end. And then, you know, of course, all that happened. But the bond between service members is very, very significant. There's there was a concept I had, Dr. Ed Tick, who is a very well-known expert on moral injury in the mental health field. And he said that the true nature of the military is not to attack and destroy, but to preserve and protect. To preserve a certain way of life, to protect a certain, you know, rights or homeland or something like that. And so the true nature of what service members want to do is to preserve and protect. He and I were talking specifically about, you know, Iraq or Afghanistan, and perhaps how we felt as though we were, protecting a certain way of life when we went into Afghanistan. But really, when it gets into combat, the whole idea of preserving and protecting is just to the person to your right and left. It's the people that are right there with you in the foxhole or in the vehicle. But the world really shrinks to brothers and sisters, and that's truly how I feel about the troops that I led in combat and I served with.
And has it been your experience that in working in mental health with veterans that disconnection after such a close bond when returning back home can kind of increase risk for having mental health problems without that social support at that level?
No, absolutely. I mean, this is the, Joyner's, the interpersonal theory of suicide, a sense of isolation, a sense of burdensomeness, and then the acquired lethal means. And so when a veteran leaves the military or leaves combat, well, that isolation is sort of baked in. And then, veterans, of course, want to, we want to be strong. We want to help each other. I mean, and exactly the sacrifice, because that's really what Ryan did at the end of the movie was, he sacrificed the opportunity to go home, to be able to serve with his brothers. And that was a very selfless act. And it very likely would have been psychologically damaging if Miller would not have allowed Ryan to stay. It likely would have damaged him to a significant degree.
So that's interesting that you say that, because it seems like one of the other themes in the movie is struggling for meaning. For example, one of the people says to the captain that even if none of this works out, it will be a good thing to have saved Private Ryan to get him back to his mom after she's lost so many people. And so it sounds like what you're saying there, similarly, that Ryan deciding to stay and kind of have that agency about it, that maybe gave him more meaning or sense of agency than he otherwise would have had.
Right. And I think the difference between what I call it the fake Ryan and the real Ryan, right? The first Ryan, yes, they had just lost Caparzo, and they had gone through even more by the time they got to the real Ryan. but the grief reaction of the first Ryan, and as you said, I think Ryben even, gripes to the commander, I told you he was an asshole or whatever it was, right? That that they were like, I knew this guy was going to be a goofball and that we just wasted a good man for a bad, person. And so, and again, that's that idea of trying to figure out why are we doing this, and seeing this bumpkin, really, the way I think they described him, that didn't sit well with the squad.
I think that was probably just reflecting, I think, on fake Ryan or Minnesota Ryan and his differing reaction to hearing that his brothers had died compared to real Ryan, I guess. I think was really striking, and I suppose a big part of what elicited some of that respect from the guys is, fake Ryan. I think he actually fell over, and then not only that, but even when he found out that no, his brothers were almost certainly okay because they were still in grade school, I think he still wanted to go home just in case something might have happened, as opposed to real Ryan, who, okay, he took a second and he processed it pretty quickly and then sort of set it aside to re-engage with what was going on here and there, and stay engaged and committed to the bridge and to the people who he had been working with and serving with up until that moment.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. Just this the commitment to the mission. And Katie, you had talked about before a little bit about the justification, trying to find meaning. And I was thinking back to when the sergeant and Captain Miller were in the church, and Captain Miller's sort of enumerating, and I wrote it. He's lost 94 men. And he says, I've lost 94 men, but I tell myself that for every man I've lost, I've saved maybe 2 or 3. And he says that those 94 men, maybe I've saved 200. And he said, that's how you make the rationale when you choose between the mission and the men. And then this time the mission is the man. And so it's this mission-oriented thing. But then even Captain Miller's struggling in that point where he says, well, I wouldn't trade 10 Ryans for 1 Caparzo or 1 Vecchio. It's still trying to search for that. Why are we doing this?
No, I think that the mission is the man was one of the strongest lines of the movie for me. I thought that was a big moment for sure. And just grappling with the mission and what it means and what it's costing for sure.
And what the captain at various points throughout, because it's clear he is making the calls and making decisions about things. And a couple of times they ask him, what are the orders? And he says, I don't know, and to me, you kind of see the vulnerability there. This is obviously a guy who's seen a lot of situations and seen a lot of combat. And yet there are times when he really just doesn't know what to do. And some of it does seem like he's thinking about keeping people safe, staying on mission, and just balancing a number of things at the same time. But the decisions have to be made very quickly, which I just can't imagine. And that's part of why it's just so tragic at the end, that he dies, especially after talking about wanting to get back to his wife, his worries that he won't be the same person anymore, but now he's not even going to go back to his wife.
Right, and that stress that he's experiencing, and again, this idea of we don't have a blinking sign that says PTSD here. Post-traumatic stress disorder, it can be challenging to depict because it is a psychological or behavioral condition, neurological condition. But the shaking of the hand, and a lot of people, when they're talking about the movie, is that Parkinson's disease. But that's actually a psychogenic tremor that indicates the amount of stress that Captain Miller is under. He and Sergeant Horvath had fought in North Africa, and I don't think that all of these soldiers had been there, but they had already been through, one campaign in one theater, and then, he revealed to Sergeant Horvath first about the shaking of the hand. And he said this started when we started out on embarkation. So just before D-Day is when he noticed that it starts. And this tremor that he has shows up in these high stress situations. And so these psychogenic tremors, that's a less well-known symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, I certainly didn't know that.
Yeah, I think that the scene where he's holding the compass and he's having that tremor and the men are kind of looking and almost side-eye, like kind of observing this, I think is one of a really powerful and a really well acted scene. And I think another facet of Captain Miller that I found really interesting is he seems to want to keep that from all of the men. There's a scene where he just breaks down sobbing, but he does that well away from the guys. And you can see he's maybe a little bit embarrassed that they saw his hand shaking with the compass. And there's even it's a little more lighthearted, but I think it's in the same line of thinking. The scene where he kind of says, yeah, I don't complain downward. If I'm going to complain, it only goes up. I wouldn't do that to you guys. And like I said, I think that's a little more lighthearted, but I think it's still the same idea, is that he sort of wants to keep that from his men and kind of have this display that things are okay, things are calm, we're going to kind of get through this. So I thought that's an interesting component of his character and how he's portrayed.
Yeah, and I think it does a very good job of depicting the different kind of stress. And here we are going back to moral injury, the different kind of stress that a leader goes through in combat versus what an individual soldier goes through in combat. The individual soldier has I lost my buddy, but a leader has I was responsible for this man's safety or these 94 men's safety, and I failed, right? And there's this idea of no matter how much stress I'm under, I have to I can't show weakness. And Katie, you had even mentioned when I think that when the captain finally came to his senses, especially at the machine gun nest where he decided, I'm not going to shoot this guy, that he was on the fence. I mean, he could have gone either way at that moment. There was a group of them, and pretty much the remainder of the squad were all for shooting the prisoner in revenge for Wade's death. Upham, of course, was very much on this isn't right, this is against the Geneva Convention. And really, Captain Miller had a moral struggle that was a burden for him because he was the leader that had to make the decision.
Yeah, it seemed like a relatable thing that there's so much unfairness and injustice going on around that they feel this one thing almost felt symbolic for some justice, that the person who killed our friend, now we're going to kill him. And so it is interesting because it's not clear what Miller's going to decide, but it does seem something clicks in him and he decides to approach it that way by thinking about who he is in the other aspect of his life, and maybe reconnecting with the morals that he as school teacher has. So, or even talking about, his wife, and it's almost like he's thinking about what future him will think about his decision at that point. But he certainly does seem ambivalent about it.
I'm thinking back of even a little bit later in the movie when he asks himself, how am I going to tell my wife about days like today? Mm-hmm. And I think that it's another nice example of where he's struggling. And I think he also, even at one point, he says something along the lines of, every man that he kills, he feels like he's further from home. So I think he is kind of grappling with what's going on and what impact is that having on him as a person, and who he'll be when he goes home to his wife, and recognizing or saying that, will she even recognize me? Am I even the same person? So I think that's a lot of reflection and a really interesting, just a really interesting character for sure, and an interesting experience. Yeah.
And I think this is a unique aspect of World War II. So World War II veterans, they were there for 3 or 4 years, right? They didn't have in each of the conflicts, there was a different method of deploying our troops. In current conflicts, we all go over as a unit. We're there for a year, maybe 15 months or 18 months at the most for some of the longest serving units. But you go as a group, you're there for a confined period of time, and you come back as a group. In Vietnam, famously, they had individual replacements, which has been shown to actually erode the bond that we were talking about earlier. Is, it's, you have 3 months you're the new guy, then you have 6 months of figuring things out, then you don't want to get close to anybody in the last 3 months. But by that time, and historically, they'd probably been overseas for a couple of years, and having, just think of how much we changed, right, from 1 year to the next, or even, how different we were 3 years ago. But that length of time that he's taken and how much he's changed, and he is sort of, pre-grieving, whatever challenges he's going to get when he goes back.
One of the other things that you mentioned that's kind of adaptive, could be adaptive while deployed, but is not adaptive maybe when you return home, is even just expressing emotions at all. And from the few people I've worked with post-traumatic stress disorder, it seems like in the environment that they might have been in during the trauma, it's safer if they don't show emotions and they don't share how they're feeling. But then it ends up interfering with some of their relationships later on. And actually can be hard in therapy. It's understandable that that's not an easy thing to just reverse. But you kind of see that a few times where people are trying to push down their feelings and not let other people see them, and maybe not even trying not to experience them, which is kind of counter to human nature a lot of the time, of how, again, like reacting to hearing that your siblings died. And so that is another part that struck me as a huge challenge, maybe in adapting in a different environment, to go back to kind of feeling your emotions more fully and sharing them with other people more fully.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And going back to Brandon, your example of the glider, that was just such a matter-of-fact conversation. There wasn't really anger there. There wasn't much malice. I mean, it was just like, it was FUBAR, right? This is just another, 25 men died because of this one man, and he wasn't even, saved, but it was all just such a matter-of-fact conversation. And some of that has to do with, it's very hard to be emotional when you're just physically worn out. These are, they'd probably been up for, I think even, they showed it was like a 3-hour rest, and you got basically a nap and then you're back out. And so you're physically worn out, you're psychologically worn out, you're emotionally worn out, and you just don't have that much emotion to give. And that again goes back to the idea that's protective in combat, perhaps. It's when veterans will bring that back home, and that remains their coping technique when it's no longer protective and it's actually detrimental. There's one other aspect of, and really of survivor's guilt. And, and Ryan is saying, why me? But I'd like your thoughts on the end, right? As Captain Miller says, this guy better, invent the longer lasting light bulb or cure some disease. He better, we're doing all of this. He better make it worth it. But then old Private Ryan is standing there, and he's begging his wife essentially, tell me I've lived a good life. Tell me I'm a good man. Even these many years later, he still is feeling guilt and grief over the sacrifice on his behalf.
Yeah, I felt it was just such a sad situation, because I do think Miller in part was trying to justify and find meaning in tragedy. And I think if you look at the situation, a lot of the decisions were made because of circumstances that happened that were out of people's control. And then it's trying to make it so that it was all worth something, which is a completely understandable human drive that we all have, especially if you're looking back on your life as you're dying, that, I want it to be worth something. But at the same time, I could see that haunting Ryan as he gets older, because of course he didn't make the decisions that they were going to go on this mission to get him. That's not actually his call. It wasn't his fault in a number of ways, and yet he feels to justify the sacrifice, he has to not just be a good person or not just survive so that his family has one remaining son. He has to actually reach these high levels of contribution to society. And that seems like a lot of pressure. I'm not saying that Miller was wrong for saying that at all, but it just seems like that would be very difficult to deal with on top of all of the loss that you've already been through.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think it's such a beautiful consistency of the character portrayal as well, and how even right when Captain Miller and crew find Ryan finally, and he hears, two people died just trying to find him, and he takes that very seriously and asks what their names were in a way of trying to recognize that sacrifice in the moment. So I think right from the get-go, he takes it so seriously that these men were sent specifically to find him, while also he recognizes his commitment to the mission and the men who he's been there with, and in his decision or desire to not want to leave despite that. So I'm sure all of that really culminated in a very powerful response after, Miller said, earn this, James. So I think that it was really powerful to see that scene at the end of the movie where he's almost begging Miller's, memory and his wife for that validation or that acknowledgement that he did good enough to make their sacrifice worth it. And I just think that was, I feel like I'm using the word powerful a lot for this movie, but it was another powerful scene, right. And it's a powerful movie,
And I think that in even where he's there and he's talking to Miller and even the respect that his family has to kind of stay back and not even sure. I mean, and I even got the sense, and this is typical, that his wife didn't even know who he was. Mm-hmm. Like he's never talked about Captain Miller, but yet he says every day since then I have thought about those words that you said to me. And I hear that with Vietnam veterans that I work with. I mean, I have Vietnam veterans. There's not a Vietnam veteran who's younger than 65 today. And there's just now Vietnam veterans in the last 2 or 3 years that have reached out and started to deal with things with the late onset PTSD. Now they're retired, more time on their hands. But I have Vietnam veterans that say there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about Vietnam. And arguably, for me, there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about Iraq or Afghanistan, but I'm actually still in the milieu, right? I'm still working with veterans in a very, ongoing way. But it just, the persistence of, at that time, it had been, 30 years. And every day for 30 years, he has thought about Captain Miller, but he actually has not communicated or mentioned Captain Miller to his wife at all, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Both of my grandfathers that I mentioned and one of my grandmothers were World War II veterans and did not talk about it much at all. Certainly not to me, which was partially because of my age when a few of them died. But my parents also said the same thing. And so to have this idea that you had this hugely impactful experience, and I'm sure it varies a lot between people, that feels almost like you have a side that people don't know except the people that were there with you. Even that is something that seems very specific with people who have been deployed, and that would be hard for people who haven't to relate to this idea that you have people in your life who are very close to you and significant, but they don't know these big portions of who you are, And
it's not, I think, that it's held through shame, because he wears his 101st pin. You can tell that he actually is proud. He's a proud veteran. It's taking the entire family to France where where Captain Miller was buried. I mean, this is a huge undertaking. And so this is obviously something that he's very proud of. And his family know in a general sense, but in the specific sense, it's just not there. And again, I refer back to Vietnam, and this is my father and 3 of my uncles served in Vietnam. It wasn't until after I was in the Army for 8 or 10 years and about to deploy to Iraq the first time. Then my father first really started talking about it. And it wasn't until after I came back that I started hearing more specifics. And I was 35 years old when I first went to Iraq. And so it's this thing about, what we don't talk about, it's hidden inside, but also what we don't talk about. And this goes back to mental health in general. If it's not spoken and if it's not addressed sort of out loud, it can really just sort of linger and fester, I guess.
Absolutely.
I have a question, if you don't mind answering it, that came up because you were talking about Vietnam versus World War II and some of the differences there. Some of the things I've read about that I wonder if it's consistent with your experience is that vets from veterans from Vietnam versus from World War II sometimes have different mental health experiences related to the way that society thinks about the value of going to war in Vietnam versus World War II and what was accomplished ultimately through those wars. Is that something that comes up with different people you work with?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, so World War II, and this is sort of how they break down, is World War II, the veterans came back and they were celebrated, right? And of course, there were so many, people mobilized in World War II that everybody knew somebody, right? There was, it was a very common thing. And then Korean War, was really, a lot of there was the draft, of course, still then, and some men were drafted in, but it was sort of the career people who were in World War and then World War II and then Korea, but sort of Korea was this forgotten war. But by the time we emerged into the late 60s, the nation had changed its attitude towards the war. And many Vietnam veterans came back and were reviled, essentially. But they didn't feel like they fit in. And it was really about 15 years until the mid 80s that a lot of when the Vietnam Memorial was established and President Reagan really staged this, we need to welcome them home. Again, personal. The first time I was about 14 years old, and that was about the mid 80s when my father and my uncle took me to this gathering of Vietnam veterans. And I remember to this day very clearly my uncle saying, "This is my welcome home." And they served 67 to 69. So 15, almost 20 years, they had to deny, quote unquote, their veteranness. And there's still a lot of bitterness that a lot of Vietnam veterans have around that. And then we start the cycle all over again as the Gulf War happened it was 100 hours combat in the Persian Gulf War in the early 90s, sort of the forgotten war. And now we've emerged into this first, cross-generational war because we've been, in Iraq, in various on and off in Syria, but Afghanistan sustained for the last 18 years. And so some of the veterans now feel like they've gotten all three of those. Okay, you come back, you treat me like a hero. Other times you sort of, look down on me because you think I'm a crazy combat vet. And other times, there's still a war going on. So it's now sort of all three of these things have coalesced. But there is that big difference between Vietnam, Korea, and World War II, the nation's response to those veterans.
That I could see how that could be a major factor in terms of how people view whether what they did was worthy or whether they feel like they're being valued by other people. I mean, we're social creatures, and so getting feedback about what you did, if it was heroic versus, like you said, being reviled, it just seems like that could be a major component too.
And the involuntariness, I mean, especially in the height of the Vietnam War was when the draft or the specter of the draft, all of my father and my uncles all joined in order to avoid the draft. If you're going to get me, I'm going to, at least choose what I'm going to do. And so it was like, it was, you're holding me, and this is something I've literally heard from Vietnam veterans is I'm being held responsible for just doing what I was supposed to do. And I call especially the draftees or, they're the reluctant warriors. They went and they did their job and they served in the draftees, in the lottery, they had to serve for 2 years. They didn't want to do it, but they did it because they felt it was their duty. And when they came back, most of them, many of them, their fathers were in World War II, their older brothers were in Korea, and they came back expecting the same sort of thing, and they got the exact opposite. And that has been a lot of the challenge for Vietnam veterans, is the response of the nation post-military, as much, if not more, than what they experienced in combat.
And kind of going with the theme that's come up a couple times, the idea that a lot of, especially when there's a draft situation, that hostility is, maybe it's also directed towards the people who made the decisions about the Vietnam War, but it seems like directing that towards people who were drafted or decided to do because they knew they were going to get drafted. In a way, it really doesn't make sense, and maybe it doesn't have to make sense, but it seems like more of that. If people are upset with it about it, which is completely understandable, directing that towards people who were drafted or decided to go because of the draft it seems like it can be really harmful to people and not really compassionate about what their situation was and is.
No, I think you're exactly right. The idea of, and again, you had mentioned the meaning making, that somebody has to pay, right? And I can't get them, right? I can't be angry at them and whoever they are, but there is this person, there's this national anger around what's going on, and I need to have a target. But even it goes back to Captain Miller is, well, I've got to hold on to something, and that something is getting Private Ryan home, right? I've got to hold on to some type of, this has to make sense in some way. And I have to, he even, I think, said it himself a couple times, I have to rationalize this to myself or else I'll go crazy. Non-clinically, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this has been amazing. I was very much looking forward to this. And it's lived up absolutely to my expectations. I'd like to have a couple of final thoughts from each of you about sort of the psychology of Saving Private Ryan.
I can start. Well, I think I want to qualify it, I guess. Speaking as someone who hasn't served in the military and a non-veteran, you're very much the expert on this area, Dwayne, but from someone with my perspective, I think that the psychology of the film was just really, really well portrayed, both with the writing and the acting, and just such a well done film. And I think that a lot of the psychological themes related to the experiences of trauma and loss and making challenging decisions and grappling with morality and deciding what's the right thing to do or what's the good thing to do, and are those the same. I think it depicted all of these themes so incredibly well, and in a way that, at least from my perspective, seemed really, really genuine and accurate, and done in a way to, at least with my viewing experience, instilled a lot of, empathy for the experience of people who go through these kind of events that are outside of anything that I've ever participated in or experienced or been a part of. So I think the psychology of the film, in terms of what you can ask for from a fictional example, is just really exceptionally well done, and a positive, kind of empathetic, accurate portrayal.
And I completely agree with everything Brandon said, and the only thing I'll add is that I felt this way before, but after seeing the movie again, it's just so clear that we have to provide appropriate mental health care for veterans for the things that they're doing. Now, I understand this was specific to World War II, but still, there are elements of that still in existence. And absolutely. I have some family currently in military too, and so I think about these things. In addition to just thinking more broadly, when I was a professor, I had students who were veterans, for example, and we have to make sure as a society that the access to these resources are available to these people who have been through a lot and who need it and have worked for the country. And the least we can do is make sure that they're supported when they get back so that they can have the highest quality of life possible.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. The idea of the need is there, right? And from my experience, a personal experience, but also my clinical work is veterans really do want people to understand what they went through. This is one of I deal with a lot of paradoxes. I think we do in mental health and generally, but a number of paradoxes that veterans struggle with is they want people to know what they experienced, but at the same time, there's no way you're going to get it out of them. So there's this dichotomy that's sort of, in opposition to each other. And veterans can point to Saving Private Ryan and said, oh, do you want to know what I went through? Here, watch this, right? So it's a way to sort of filter their story. It's a way to tell their story and sort of communicate to that. And that's why I think a lot of veterans have rallied around this, because they're not going to stand up, and say, like you just said, Katie, I need this help, or this help is important. They'll just let you watch Saving Private Ryan and come to your own conclusion. So I think that, again, a very well done movie, but also, it's sustaining. I think it was, we're going on 20 years since it was created. And I literally remember watching this film in the theaters. Me and a friend of mine, we were at Fort Bragg. I was in the 82nd Airborne Division. He and I went to the one movie theater in Fayetteville and watched it. And when the lights came up, it was dead silent. And nobody was looking at each other. It's like, I'm not crying, you're crying, right? But there was this, it was so powerful. And I remember it even clearly to this day, that, it was almost like, I was breathless, and even by that time I hadn't deployed to combat. I think I'd been to Bosnia and it wasn't necessarily combat, and so it's a way for veterans to say, here's this story, hear our story without me actually having to go through telling it. And I think that really speaks to what I think both of you were talking about, was both the power of the movie emotionally, but also the testament of what we as a nation might owe those who served.
And the idea that, like you said, that art can be meaningful in that way, that it can actually share the story that might be hard to tell, but through the direction of Steven Spielberg and all the many good actors in the film, that can communicate it. I mean, that's just such a powerful notion and that exists, and I'm grateful for movies that do that.
Yes, absolutely. So, I'd like to give you an opportunity. I really enjoyed this. I was looking for, when I first connected with Katie, I was like, my wife has been hearing about this for weeks ever since we've, because I really enjoy what you do. If people want to hear more about this, and you guys have talked about, I listen to the Punisher episodes. I listen to the Big Lebowski episodes. I am a fan of the dude. I don't practice nice. Dudism. I'm not a dudist, but it is a good film. But so how can they find more about you, maybe on social media, and how to check out the Jedi Counsel podcast?
Well, first of all, I think Ted is the one who connected us, so I want to thank Ted, who I only know through a little Twitter and email. Do I have that right?
Yeah, Ted Bonar actually is I blame him for a lot of stuff anyway. So yeah, we'll...
Well, thank you, Ted. We really appreciate it. Our website is Jedi-Counsel, COUNSEL.com, and from there you can see our podcast episodes, our blog posts that we also do or have done fictional diagnostic reports that are up there. And my Twitter handle is at DRKATHRYNGORDON.
Yeah. And mine is at Brandon, BRANDON _Saxton, SAXTON. And yeah, always happy to connect with folks on Twitter. And Dwayne, I have to say, I love following you on Twitter. You do such awesome work and you produce such amazing content. And this has been just an absolute treat to connect with you and have this opportunity to kind of share this film experience with you, and especially someone with your expertise and your background and experiences. I think this has really been a highlight for me.
I've learned a lot. I feel like I have a much better understanding, certainly of moral injury and other aspects too. So thank you.
Yeah, and anytime you want to, say you think you're talking about mental health when it comes to veterans, so give me a call. I'll parachute in. I'll give you a few thoughts, and then I'll take off.
We appreciate that.
We love that.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. We've talked a lot about these concepts in a number of Headspace and Timing podcasts: PTSD, purpose and meaning, moral injury. All of these aspects are seen in Saving Private Ryan. One of the reasons the film resonates so much from veterans of all eras is because what was true psychologically in World War II is true in today's current conflicts. I appreciate Katie and Brandon taking the time to break down some of the ideas in the movie. Ironically, on the day that we were recording this, Brandon and I had a conversation about how his clinical psychology program had held a seminar on veteran mental health just that afternoon. It's encouraging to hear that those who never served are taking an interest in serving veterans and veteran mental health, and that it's being discussed in many clinical programs around the country. Make sure to check out the Jedi Counsel Podcast on Twitter and Facebook, as well as everything else at jedi-counsel.com, spelled COUNSEL. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST101. While you're there, share the link to someone that you think may enjoy it. As a reminder, we've got so many great guests coming up that we're releasing 2 shows a week, one on Tuesday and one on Thursday. There's been so much interest, and we've got a lot of great guests coming on, that we're doubling up in order to bring them all to you. You can still receive the blog posts as well, which will be released on Wednesdays. You can find out how to get everything at veteranmentalhealth.com/subscribe. On that note, we're always looking for guests. You can drop me a line at info@veteranmentalhealth.com to recommend guests, or you can go to veteranmentalhealth.com/guest to fill out a suggestion or request. Just a reminder that the guests and information on the show are for educational purposes only and not meant to be considered to be professional advice. While me, Katie, and Brandon are mental health professionals, we are not your mental health professionals. If something you heard that we talked about makes you think that you should talk to somebody, then reach out to do so. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track Not Alone from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Be on the lookout for another great episode, and until then, remember, veterans, you're not alone, ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-creating enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep staying. How this life so demanding, so much pain on this planet. I hurt each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Yeah, every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every nail that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep staying.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain
love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sea. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith about my head.